Let's see if we can make this really weird right off the bat. You know what I loved about the 2016 Donald Trump campaign? Was all that language about draining the swamp. Did that happen? Come on. I don't think you can make a reasonable case for that being a campaign promise that he delivered on. But I think if you took away the politics and the fighting and the stuff about whose side is whose side and what color you like better, and you just blind taste tested the idea as a political premise in the United States of America in 2016 or now, if you blind taste tested the idea amongst all voters, hey, do you think the government's pretty corrupt and it would be really good to get rid of all that corruption? It would have been roughly 99.9 to 0, with the 0.1 saying, I don't think there's any corruption. We should keep things as they are, being the people who are corrupt. Everybody can see it when the other team does corruption. They have a tougher time seeing it when their own team does corruption. But you take away the bombastic personality and all the other things that came with Hurricane Trump alongside Hurricane Clinton and Hurricane Biden. We've had remarkable public figures of late. You take away all the hurricanes and you just go with that premise. Do you trust the people in power right now? And would you like to see some sort of nonviolent, but some sort of political purge wherein the people who have made this mess, both in elected and not elected ways, would be held accountable and no longer given the opportunity to do corrupt things? I think at any point in the last 10, 15 years, you would get overwhelming agreement from my country's citizenry to say, yes, we would love to see things get cleaned up. The disagreement is just in who does the cleaning up and what do you replace the cleaned up stuff with. All of that's a conversation for a different podcast with a different host about different subject matter. Make of contemporary politics whatever you will. Generally speaking, when we are dispassionate, we can look at a corrupt situation and our sense of justice says you got to clean house. If you want to get that stuff straightened out, you got to pull it out by the root. Find every bit of corruption in that system and just start over. Replace it anew with people you trust, people of integrity, and see what happens. It can't be worse than that. That's the kind of thinking people generally have, again, when they are dispassionate and removed from it. Now, we know Nehemiah to be a very courageous, convictional, decisive leader. And at the end of chapter 6, which is kind of the end of Act 2 of the book of Nehemiah, the end of the wall building act, there's a little tag that we spent a few days on that is the corruption tag. We could just call it that. And I think what we're going to come to realize about that little corruption tag at the end of chapter 6 as we get into chapter 7 and forward is that Nehemiah put that there to help the reader understand what he was going to do next. Because what he's going to do next is trust no one from the establishment. He is going to grab the corruption by the root and pull out every last bit of that political and cultural corruption that he can get his hands on, and then salt the place where those corrupt weeds were growing. Look, it's permeated everything. Clearly, that's what Nehemiah is telling us. It's permeated the prophets. Prophets were buyable. How are prophecies communicated? Well, in part verbally, but religious truth is also communicated artistically, as we talked about yesterday. So it's permeated the art sector. It's permeated the political sector deeply. It's permeated the business sector because families who were involved in certain businesses listed in Nehemiah chapter 3 during the build montage are also involved in corrupt, compromising business relationships with Tobiah and Sanballat and Geshem. As the last stone is being placed on top of the wall and as the last gate is being hung, Nehemiah is seeing a situation rife with corruption and compromise. And if he wants what he's invested in to hold after he has to go back to Susa here in a little bit, he's going to have to clean out this establishment. And you can't just leave nothing. He's got to replace all of this corruption with something he can trust. So he starts with a vital position of practical trust, the people who manage the gates. And he's going to give even more instructions later on here in Nehemiah chapter 7 about how the gates are to be managed. But he starts with character. Nehemiah 7:1, after the walls had been rebuilt and I had set the doors in place, the gatekeepers, there's the first bit of corruption he's replacing get replaced, and the singers and the Levites were appointed. We talked yesterday about what his thinking might have been regarding appointing new singers, new artists, but also the Levites. These are people descended from the tribe of Levi. These are people whose job it is to support the priestly ministry and the work of the temple. This is basically the temple bureaucracy we're talking about when we talk about the Levites. The bureaucracy is where a lot of people who think that there needs to be some sort of cleanup of the corruption of the government of my country or maybe your country. The bureaucracy is what a lot of people will point to. Am I going to tell this story? Have I told it before? I don't know. I guess I'm going to tell the story. I had an occasion once to go to a meeting to do a thing at the White House. Doesn't matter which president. Not that big a deal. Sounds way fancier than it is. Not much ended up coming out of the meeting that I had there, but after the meeting, a young staffer in this administration gave me a tour around the White House where the meeting had been and around the building next door where the vice president, where his executive offices are. And as we're walking around, he's musing on the quickly approaching end of his tenure there in this administration. He said, when we came in, we thought the last guy was an idiot. He did everything wrong. And we just come in and we just write things down and we just fix it. We just make it so that the stupid things can't happen anymore. We get rid of the bad people. And then we would have a good and pure government that we could be proud of again. And then at this point, the kid showing us around, he started to look pretty haggard. And he's like, but wow, were we in for a rude awakening? Because we're not totally in charge here. There are powerful forces at play that don't even really have a name, bureaucracies, administrations. And he said, this isn't nearly as powerful an institution as an outsider would imagine. Speaking of the executive branch of the United States government, that's crazy. We call the person who has that position the leader of the free world, but somebody who worked in close proximity to that office in an administration was telling me while I was walking around the White House with him, hey, it's not as powerful as you think. The bureaucracy is very powerful, and who can name anybody who's a part of the bureaucracy? I got to think the same thing is happening here. So what is Nehemiah to do if he only has a very short time before he has to go far, far away, all the way back to the king's throne room in Susa? What's he to do? Well, you can't just fix the music. You can't just fix the gatekeeper brigade. You have to fix the bureaucracy. And in this kind of cultural, religious setting, the Levites would have been the place to shoot at. And so this is a much bigger deal that's happening here in the first verse of Nehemiah chapter 7 than it's going to look like to you and me. To come in and basically start over with all the people who make the temple stuff happen, to start over with your bureaucracy is a huge move. Think about how powerful somebody in your country, your state, if you happen to live in the same country as me, would have to be to come in and simply say, yeah, we're done with this entire bureaucracy. All the people who really affect things and are the deciders, we're starting all over and I'm appointing all of these new ones. How powerful would they have to be? I mean, I'm not even going to deign to say out loud into a microphone what I suspect might happen, but I'll just invite you to consider it for yourself. What do you think might happen to such an upstart leader in your country if they came along and decided to do a complete overhaul, a complete political purge, no killing, just swapping out people in positions of the entire middle management bureaucracy of your government? What would happen to them? You think all those institutions would just be like, oh, dang it. Well, you filed the paperwork. Okay, I guess that's how it is. Or would there be some sort of resistance, and what would that look like? How much power does Nehemiah have to have in this moment? How much clout in order to grab what he views and has demonstrated to be corruption by the root and start yanking it out the way he is? We're only one verse into Nehemiah chapter 7, and he is already doing things that I imagine to be unfathomable, simply impossible to carry out in my country right now. And yet here Nehemiah is taking these kinds of swings and genuinely trying to set this situation up for lasting success. These are massive reforms. However big you imagine them to be, I think that's still not enough. These are massive reforms that he is carrying out in an attempt to clean up corruption and put people into those positions who understand the grand narrative of redemptive history and where this moment fits into it. And as we continue to look at Nehemiah chapter 7, we'll see what he does and how it works out. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.